the architect of hollow geometry. The campus of Arkwright Institute was a thing of stone and silence. Built in 1883 on the outskirts of Yorkshire, the architecture school looked more like a mausoleum than a place of learning. Its dark bricked walls were always cold to the touch, and ivy crept over the Gothic arches like veins over a corpse. Dr. Leonard Craine had only been teaching there for 4 months, but the place had already gotten under his skin. Not in the poetic, inspirational way, but like a splinter that refused to dislodge. He stepped into his third-year architectural theory class just as the old bell tower struck 9. The sound echoed like a groan through the hallways. 27 students sat waiting. Some were scribbling in notebooks. Some stared blankly out the tall, arched windows that filtered in pale light like it had been diluted by fog. And then there was Marion Cross. He sat in the far back corner, alone at a table meant for 2. He never took notes, never asked questions. His face was thin and pale, sharp at the edges like someone had carved it out of soapstone. There was a stillness to him that made Leonard uncomfortable. Not quietness, stillness, like he was waiting for something. That morning's lecture was on spatial logic, how geometry shaped human behavior in buildings, how pathways guided emotion, perception, fear, and comfort. Leonard prided himself on making the abstract visceral. He even used examples from local buildings to keep it grounded. As he finished discussing the flow of St. Albans Cathedral and how its architecture directed reverence like an invisible current, he glanced again at Marion. The boy was staring at him, utterly still, hands folded, unblinking. After class, as the room emptied, Leonard noticed something odd. On his desk lay a manila envelope, slightly warped by moisture, with his name written in perfect calligraphy. There was no return address, no name. He opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper. It was a blueprint, and it was signed. Marion Cross, assignment I. Leonard frowned. He hadn't given the first project yet. It was meant to be announced next week. The blueprint was for an underground chapel. He studied it, flipping on his desk lamp as clouds thickened outside the tall windows. The structure was intricate, too intricate. It was a sunken, circular sanctuary buried beneath an artificial hill, with no above-ground markers or access paths. Entry was only possible through a narrow spiral stairwell hidden inside what appeared to be a hollowed gravestone. Inside, pews spiraled toward a deep central altar. Walls lined with alcoves bore no symbols or crosses. Instead, there were unlabeled geometric shapes, interlocking polygons forming ever-repeating tessellations. The ceiling was domed, but unlike any dome Leonard had ever seen. Its curvature inverted inward, a shape that felt physically wrong. He blinked. For a moment, just a moment, the lines on the blueprint seemed to shift, almost imperceptibly. The longer he looked, the more it felt like the room was tilting slightly, like his brain was trying to compensate for a geometry that shouldn't exist. He sat back, exhaling. It was brilliant, disturbing, impossible, and yet mathematically sound. Leonard ran his fingers along the edge of the paper. It felt warmer than it should. That night, he dreamed, not in images, but in space. He was walking down a long corridor of smooth stone, dimly lit by wall sconces that flickered with no source of flame. The walls whispered, not words, something older than language. Shapes, concepts. As he turned a corner, the corridor grew narrower, tighter. At the end, there was a door, circular, carved with the same interlocking shapes from Marion's blueprint. When Leonard reached for it, he woke up, cold sweat. 3:17 a.m. His apartment above the old faculty housing was silent, save for the tick of a wall clock. He stood, walked to his desk, pulled the blueprint from the envelope again. The ink was faded slightly, but now, in the top right corner, something had been added, a symbol drawn in graphite, a triangle with one eye crossed out. 3 days passed. Leonard couldn't stop thinking about the blueprint. He left it in a locked drawer in his office, but each time he passed the hallway that led to his room, he felt a pull, like gravity had twisted slightly, urging him back toward it. The lectures went on as usual. No one else submitted early. No one mentioned Marion's project. Marion himself sat quietly in class, just as before, still, unblinking, hands folded. Leonard found himself avoiding eye contact with the boy. Not out of fear, exactly, but something closer to dread wrapped in fascination. That Thursday evening, the air over the Arkwright campus turned heavy. A storm rolled in from the east, low thunder crawling like a beast across the fields. Leonard worked late, as he often did, reviewing other students' proposals and trying to forget the one that wasn't supposed to exist. But the papers blurred. His vision pulsed at the edges. When he blinked, the shapes from Marion's blueprint danced behind his eyelids. He rubbed his face and decided to go home. A 5-minute walk through the winding, ivy-laced corridors of faculty housing. But he never made it back. It began somewhere between the old chemistry hall and the sculpture building. The sky was deep gray, and the wind had picked up. He walked through the narrow passage between the buildings, one he'd passed 100 times, when the air shifted. Like a sudden pressure change, the brick walls around him stretched longer than he remembered. He turned back. The passage behind him was darker, wider. He stopped. The trees that had always bordered the western edge of campus were gone. Instead, there was only stone. Dark, polished walls that sloped upward like a canyon. He kept walking. His footsteps no longer echoed. Then he saw it. A door, perfectly circular, etched into the stone with the same impossible geometry. Interlocking polygons, and an eye with a jagged line scratched through it. It looked ancient. But worse than that, it looked familiar. His feet moved without permission. When he reached out, the surface was warm, pulsing faintly beneath his fingers. The door opened. He was inside a corridor, but the walls were all wrong. They slanted inward and outward at once, and the ceiling curved downward like a wave frozen mid-crash. There were no lights, yet the space glowed dimly in a muted, off-white haze. The floor beneath him was smooth, not stone, not wood, but something softer. It gave slightly under his steps, like skin stretched over muscle. The corridor turned, and turned again, and again. There were no windows, no end. Then he heard it, a whisper, not in his ears, but directly inside his thoughts. Like something old and formless was thinking through him. We do not build for the living. We do not build with hands. We build what must always be. Leonard stopped walking. The whisper faded. The corridors suddenly twisted, and his vision doubled, like his eyes were out of sync with each other. He stumbled, and then he woke up, back in his office. His chair creaked softly beneath him. The lights were on. Rain tapped against the tall window panes. The desk before him was covered in drawings, but not his students' assignments. No, these were blueprints he didn't remember making. Curved structures, spiral staircases, walls with no support, rooms that led into each other in recursive loops. He flipped through them, his hands trembling. At the bottom of the stack, there was one labeled in neat handwriting. Iteration 4, Hall of Reversal. By L. Craine. He hadn't written that, but the handwriting was undeniably his own. He left the building in a daze, barely noticing the security lights flickering as he passed. That night, sleep didn't come. Instead, he sat at his desk at home, sketching without rest, as if something were moving his hand, drawing lines that bent in impossible arcs, tracing forms that didn't obey Euclidean space. At 4 a.m., he stood and looked at his work. 7 pages of blueprints. He couldn't explain what any of them were, but each one had a small symbol in the corner. A triangle, an eye, and a jagged line slicing through them all. The next morning, Leonard arrived at the university 3 hours early. His hands were still shaking from the night before. He hadn't slept. Not truly. Every time he drifted off, he found himself back in that warped corridor, moving toward a sound he couldn't hear but somehow felt beneath his ribs. It was always just out of reach, just beyond the next corner. He avoided his office. The drawings were still there, and he wasn't ready to confront them. Instead, he walked to the faculty archives in the administration wing, a vaulted room with iron shelves and the scent of mold and lacquered wood. Few professors bothered with the archives anymore. Leonard wasn't even sure what he was looking for. Just a name, a pattern, anything. He typed Marion Cross into the database terminal. The system froze for a moment, then returned only a single file. A student record. Enrollment. Fall term, 2022. Transfer status. Incomplete. Previous institution. Red Hollow School of Design. Defunct. Health note. Request for exemption from psychological evaluation. Approved. Faculty advisor. Professor Walter Greaves. Deceased. 2023. Leonard stared at the screen. Red Hollow. He had heard of it, barely. A private architectural institute out near the coast. It had been shut down abruptly a year ago. No public statement. Just gone. And Greaves. He remembered the name. The man had died suddenly last spring. Cardiac arrest, they said. But Leonard remembered overhearing something strange in the faculty lounge. He died with a blueprint in his hands. Clutching it. Wouldn't let go until they pried his fingers apart. Leonard printed the file. On the last page, scrawled in the corner, was a small handwritten annotation. Do not approve independent studies. His designs are not from this world. There was no signature. That night, Leonard was in bed by 11. He woke up at 1:12 a.m. Not from a noise. From a feeling. The unmistakable sense that someone was standing in the room. The darkness was thick. The street lamp outside barely lit the corner of the room. He reached slowly for his phone, but his hand froze halfway. A shape stood in the far corner. Still. Tall. Too tall. Its outline was thin, not gaunt, but narrowed unnaturally, like its limbs had been drawn with a ruler. It had no face. Just a smooth, pale surface where a head should be. No eyes. No features. Just a mouth. Closed. Leonard didn't move. The thing didn't either. Then it turned. Not by rotating its body, but by shifting its presence, like a frame in a film jumping forward. It faced him, and though it had no eyes, he knew it was staring. And in his mind, not in his ears, he heard a whisper. You drew the door. Leonard gasped. And the figure vanished. Gone, as if it had never been there. By morning, he was certain it hadn't been a dream. The hallway outside his apartment smelled of charcoal and sulfur, and his front door, which had been locked from the inside, was slightly ajar. He found faint smudges on the floor. Greasy, like fingerprints made of ash. And something else. On the inside of his door, scratched deep into the wood, were 3 symbols. A triangle. An eye. A jagged line slicing through it. That afternoon, Leonard confronted Marion Cross after class. It wasn't planned. It just happened. A buildup of pressure that broke open like a dam. He waited as the students filed out, heart pounding. Marion lingered, folding his sketchbook with slow precision. Mr. Cross, Leonard said, voice strained, can we talk? Marion turned, his expression unreadable. Of course, Dr. Craine. Leonard closed the door. For a moment, the room felt smaller, like the walls had shifted inward. He walked around to his desk, trying to keep calm. I wanted to ask you about your previous school, Red Hollow. I looked into your records. It was shut down. Marion gave a polite smile. It was unfortunate, but predictable. Leonard stared at him. What does that mean? Marion tilted his head. Some institutions aren't strong enough to withstand conceptual pressure. There was no humor in his voice. No sarcasm. Just calm, measured certainty. And Professor Greaves? Leonard pressed. I liked him, Marion said. He wasn't ready, but he tried. Leonard's blood ran cold. You knew he died. I know a lot of things, Marion replied softly. Some of them even before they happen. There was a silence. Then Leonard whispered. What did I see last night? Marion paused, then leaned in just slightly and said, a guardian. Of thresholds. Of geometry unbounded. They come when you draw too close to the void between shapes. Leonard could barely breathe. Why me? Because you looked, Marion said. And now you can't unsee it. He picked up his bag, smiled faintly. You should get some rest, Dr. Craine. Your next dream will be different. And with that, he left. Leonard sat in the empty classroom for over an hour. He didn't remember falling asleep. But when he finally stood up to leave, he found something on the desk. A folded piece of paper. It was another blueprint. No title. No name. Just a single hallway. Perfectly symmetrical, with the words. The corridor walks back. The blueprint stayed on Leonard's desk for 3 days. He didn't touch it. Didn't unfold it. But it was always there, no matter where he put it. He tried locking it in a drawer. It reappeared in his briefcase the next morning. He shredded it. Burned it. Watched the ashes swirl in the sink. That night, it returned. Pristine. Folded neatly. Waiting. By Friday, Leonard gave in. He unfolded the paper with trembling fingers, expecting spirals, symbols, impossible stairwells. But it wasn't a structure this time. It was a map. A simple, ink-sketched path through the campus itself, corridors he knew, halls he'd walked 1,000 times. But something was off. There was a mark behind the west wing of the design building. A square. Labeled only. Threshold. His throat went dry. The design building had been under renovation since 2017. That section had been sealed. Asbestos. they said. No one went in. The wing had no doors from the outside. At least, no official ones. But the map showed otherwise. That evening, after everyone had left, Leonard returned to the west wing with a flashlight and a crowbar. The sky had turned purple-black. Rain threatened, but hadn't fallen yet. The air tasted like metal. He followed the route exactly as the blueprint described, cutting across the old art courtyard, stepping behind the crumbled greenhouse, past an overgrown stone well. There it was, a metal hatch, half buried under ivy and rust. Flush with the wall. No handle, no hinges, just a square of corroded steel bolted into place. Leonard knelt, pried away the ivy. At the top corner was a faint engraving. A triangle, an eye, a jagged line. His hand shook as he pressed against it. It clicked. With a long, metallic groan, the hatch swung open, on hinges that hadn't moved in decades, revealing a set of concrete steps descending into blackness. He hesitated only once, then began to descend. The air grew colder with each step. The flashlight flickered. The walls were smooth, too smooth, like poured stone or sculpted clay. At the bottom was a hallway. The same hallway from the blueprint. Perfectly symmetrical. Whitewashed walls. A polished floor that reflected light oddly, like it absorbed more than it returned. The corridor bent slightly, almost imperceptibly, as if the space itself was subtly coiling. He walked. There were no doors. No markings. Just the sound of his footsteps and the soft hum of something beyond hearing. And then, without warning, a door appeared. Not in the wall. Not attached. Just standing. Freestanding. A tall, black wooden door with a brass knob. No frame. No hinges. Just there. He circled it. There was no back. It had only one side. The rear was perfectly smooth, like a monolith of night-colored stone. But from the front, it was a door. And it was open. Not wide. Just a crack. Enough. He leaned forward, trying to see inside. There was no room beyond. Only darkness. Not the absence of light, but the presence of something else. Something that absorbed thought. Leonard reached for the knob. His fingers brushed it. It was warm. He paused, then pushed. There was no transition. He was standing in a room. Circular. No windows. No lights. Yet he could see somehow. The walls were made of shifting, tessellated patterns. The same impossible geometry as Marion's first blueprint. The floor pulsed beneath him like a sleeping animal's breath. In the center stood a mirror, 10 feet tall, framed in black stone etched with unfamiliar sigils. Leonard approached. The reflection was wrong. Not delayed. Not distorted. Just wrong. It showed him standing in an inverted room, with different shadows, a different face. Older, thinner, eyes sunken like deep wells. And behind that version of him, something moved. Tall, narrow, faceless. The Eyeless watcher. It raised one hand, pressed it against the glass. So did Leonard. Only his reflection's hand was on the inside of the mirror. The glass shimmered, then cracked. Just slightly. A hairline fracture ran across the surface. Leonard recoiled, and the light vanished. He awoke at the bottom of the stairs, hours later. The hatch above him was open. Rain was pouring in. The corridor was gone. Just cold concrete, wet and stained. He crawled out into the night, soaked and gasping. As he stumbled back toward his building, he glanced at his palm. There was a thin black line running across the skin, right where it had touched the mirror. It wouldn't wash off. It wouldn't fade. And in the distance, from some impossible depth beneath the earth, he heard the echo of a voice. Doors don't keep us out. They keep you in. Leonard dreamed in blueprints. Not the sterile, clean lines of academic diagrams, but pulsating sketches drawn in flickering charcoal, etched into skin, carved into stone. He saw spirals that bled into staircases, staircases that fell into sky, and doors that opened sideways, not into rooms, but into ideas. He woke up standing, in the middle of the corridor. Again, but this time, it wasn't in the basement beneath the design wing. This place was different, more complete, alive. The walls breathed, slowly, expanding and contracting like a chest inhaling sleep. The light came from nowhere and everywhere, a diffuse, bloodless glow that seemed to hum in tune with his own heartbeat. Leonard turned around. No door, no stairs, only hallway, only forward. He began to walk. Each step echoed oddly, like the corridor wasn't finished calculating the acoustics. The further he moved, The more the hallway shifted, the ceiling lowered. The walls narrowed. The floor began to slant, just slightly, like he was walking along the inside rim of some enormous spiral. He passed an archway, then another, and another. They all looked identical, each leading into blackness, like mouths in a creature too large to see. He glanced to his right at the fifth one. Something was there, standing, still, tall, a silhouette made of geometry, not flesh, as if the angles of its body had been drawn, not born. It had no face, no clothes, just outline. And then it moved, not walking, but shifting, sliding from one position to another in a blink. It was gone. Leonard kept walking. After what felt like an hour, or a minute, he arrived at a chamber. Circular, like all the others. But this one had a centerpiece, a massive model, like an architectural mock-up, resting on a plinth. He stepped closer. It was a building, but not just any building, his own design. One he'd drawn years ago in graduate school. An abandoned idea, an overly ambitious museum layout he never submitted. But here it was, perfectly sculpted in gray-white stone, down to the smallest window. He leaned in. Inside the model, in one of the miniature corridors, he saw movement. A figure, tiny, running. He looked closer. It was him, a model of himself, trapped inside his own design, sprinting through a hallway that should have been scale-only, impossible to enter. Leonard's breath caught. The figure paused, looked up, looked at him, and then began to scream. But there was no sound, just the vibration in Leonard's teeth. Then, the model cracked, splitting down the middle with a dry snap. The plinth beneath it opened like a drawer. Inside was a note, etched in obsidian black glass. The architect is the first prisoner. Leonard bolted awake. Back in his apartment. He was on the floor, soaked in sweat. The clock read 5:06 a.m. His bedsheets were untouched. His door was locked, but the soles of his feet were covered in dust, as if he'd walked barefoot through a forgotten cellar. His legs ached, and his hands. He looked down. Both palms were marked, not bruised, not cut, but drawn on. Ink-thin black lines had been etched in symmetrical curves and angles. Tiny letters lined the outer edge of his right hand. This way forward, but not back. He skipped classes that day. Instead, Leonard dug through the university's forgotten archives, deep in the sub-basement beneath the architecture department, a place he hadn't known existed until recently. He found Project 93, a bundle of student designs from the early 1990s, untouched since. Tucked at the bottom was a name. James Belfield. Status: withdrawn, mental health grounds. Disappeared 1995. Leonard stared at the design. It was an observatory. Circular. Stained glass. Domed roof. Subterranean rings of hallways. The exact same layout as Marion Cross's first submission. But the signature was smudged. Someone had written over it. 3 overlapping names. James Belfield. Walter Greaves. Marion Cross. Underlined in red ink, someone had added, "These are not people. They are iterations." Leonard closed the file. His breath fogged the plastic cover. A name echoed in his mind like a prayer turned curse. The corridor walks back. And it wasn't just walking anymore. It was coming.